November 10th, 1898, 5:47 in the morning, Wilmington, North Carolina. Alexander Manley stood in his newspaper office at the corner of 7th and Love Streets, and he could hear them coming. 2,000 men. The sound of their boots on cobblestone echoed through the pre-dawn darkness like distant thunder. He pressed his hand against the printing press, still warm from the midnight run. The smell of ink hung thick in the air. Outside torches moved through the streets like a river of fire flowing toward him. He knew what was coming. They had published the threats for weeks, death threats in white newspapers, warnings scrawled on his door, anonymous letters promising to burn everything he had built. But he never imagined they would do it in broad daylight, with the mayor's blessing, with the police watching and doing nothing, with 2,000 armed men marching in military formation through the streets of an American city to destroy the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina. In 24 hours, the only democratically elected black majority government in United States history would be destroyed. Every black official forced to resign at gunpoint. Every black business leader either murdered or driven into exile. Every record of their achievement burned to ashes. And for 75 years, not a single American textbook would tell you this happened. Why didn't they teach you about the only successful coup d'etat on American soil? Why don't you know the name of the city where black people ran City Hall, commanded the police department, and owned the biggest businesses? Why don't you know that your ancestors built political power so strong that white supremacists had to use military force to destroy it? What else did they erase? What else don't you know about who you really are? What happened in Wilmington wasn't a riot. The history books lied about that too. This was a planned military coup. This was domestic terrorism. This was the systematic destruction of black political and economic power. And it created the blueprint used across the entire South for the next 70 years. By the end of this video, you will understand why your vote is still under attack in 2025. You will know the names of 7 black leaders who ran an entire city just 33 years after slavery ended. You will see the exact methods white supremacists used to steal political power, and you will recognize those same methods being used right now today. This is your stolen throne. This is your erased history. This is the truth they buried. And after today, you will never see American democracy the same way again. This isn't ancient history. This happened 127 years ago, your great-grandparents' lifetime. Some of your grandparents were alive when survivors of the Wilmington Massacre were still telling their stories. The men who organized this coup never went to jail. Some became United States senators. Some had schools named after them. Their descendants inherited wealth stolen from your ancestors. And until 1998, 100 years later, the state of North Carolina officially called this event a riot caused by black people. They blamed the victims. They erased the perpetrators. They taught your parents and grandparents that their ancestors were violent and incompetent. They taught white children that their ancestors were heroes, restoring order and civilization. After this video, you will understand why the wealth gap exists, and it has nothing to do with how hard anyone works. You will know why North Carolina keeps passing voter suppression laws that federal courts say target black people with surgical precision. You will see the direct line connecting 1898 Wilmington to the voter suppression happening in your city right now today. And you will understand that the fight for black political power never ended. It just changed tactics. If your family came from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, or anywhere in the South, this affected you directly. Thousands of black families fled Wilmington after the massacre. They scattered across the country, leaving behind homes, businesses, land, and wealth they had built from nothing. Your ancestors might have been among them. This is your stolen inheritance. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. Literal wealth and literal political power that was taken by force and never returned. The descendants of the coup leaders are millionaires today from wealth stolen in 1898. Your family could have been millionaires too. That is what was taken. That is what you are owed. By the end of this video, you will know the names of 7 black leaders who ran Wilmington before the coup. Alexander Manly, newspaper editor and journalist, who spoke truth that cost him everything. John C. Dancy, United States Customs Collector, the most powerful federal position held by a black man in North Carolina. Dr. Thomas R. Mask, physician, who treated both black and white patients in his downtown office. Robert H. Bunting, merchant and real estate investor, who owned 11 properties in the heart of the city. Reverend J. W. Hood, bishop of the AME Zion Church, who planted 100 churches across North Carolina while dodging the Klan. Armand W. Scott, publisher, who owned the largest black printing company in the state. These were not activists. These were not protesters. These were elected officials, business owners, and community leaders. They were your people. And they built an empire in 33 years. You will know the exact plan white supremacists used to destroy black political power. How they manufactured a crisis. How they organized a military force. How they used propaganda to justify genocide. How they rewrote the law to make the theft permanent. How they erased it from history so you would never know what was stolen. You will see how this massacre created the Jim Crow blueprint used across the entire South. Colfax, Louisiana, Hamburg, South Carolina, Danville, Virginia, Ocoee, Florida, Rosewood, Florida, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Every single time black people built political or economic power, they destroyed it using the Wilmington playbook. And you will understand that the fight is not over. Voter ID laws, gerrymandering, precinct closures in black neighborhoods, purging voter rolls. These are not new tactics. These are the legal version of what happened in Wilmington. They cannot use red shirts and Gatling guns anymore, so they use legislation and court rulings. Different weapons, same war, and you are still the target. Let me take you back to Wilmington in 1898 before they burned it down. Picture a thriving port city on the Cape Fear River, the largest city in North Carolina. Population 20,000, 56% black, 44% white. Ships coming and going from the harbor every day. Lumber mills, cotton processing, naval stores. A booming economy built on black and white labor. But here is what made Wilmington different from every other southern city. Black people were not just working in Wilmington, they were running it. This was 33 years after the end of slavery, one generation. And in that one generation, black people in Wilmington had built something America had never seen before and has never seen since. Political power, real power, not symbolic, not token, not a single black face in a white government. Actual power, control, leadership. The city government was run by a fusion coalition, Republicans mostly black and populists mostly white. They had joined forces in the 1890s because they were both tired of the Democratic Party that represented only the wealthy plantation class. Together they won elections. Together they governed, and together they built something extraordinary. 14 of 26 police officers were black. 10 of 26 firefighters were black. 4 of 10 city aldermen, the city council, were black men. The magistrates who ran the courts, the tax collectors, the mail carriers, the customs inspectors. In nearly every level of city government, black men held positions of real authority. This was not Atlanta with a black mayor, but a white-controlled city council. This was not even Reconstruction-era South Carolina, where black politicians were a majority in the legislature, but had no real enforcement power. This was Wilmington, where black men carried badges and guns and arrested white people when they broke the law, where black men collected taxes from white businesses, where black men made decisions about city budgets and public services. And it worked. The city was thriving, crime was down, the budget was balanced, schools were improving, public services were expanding. White populists and black Republicans were proving that interracial democracy could function and succeed. This terrified the Democratic Party, not because it was failing, because it was succeeding. In 1898, Wilmington was not just politically integrated, it was economically powerful. There were over 300 black-owned businesses in the city: grocery stores, restaurants, barbershops, tailor shops, construction companies, shipping companies, black lawyers practicing in courtrooms, black doctors with offices downtown treating patients of all races. And at the center of it all was the Wilmington Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina, founded in 1895 by Alexander Manly. Circulation 1,400 copies, distributed across the state. A voice that could not be silenced, could not be ignored, could not be controlled. Alexander Manly was 32 years old in 1898. Born in 1866, right after the Civil War ended. His father was Charles Manly, a white man who had been governor of North Carolina. His mother was Corinne Manly, a free black woman. Alexander was light-skinned enough to pass for white if he wanted to. But he never did. He was proud of his black heritage. He went to Hampton Institute. He learned the printing trade. And he came back to North Carolina to build something his people needed. A newspaper that told the truth, not the version white newspapers printed, not the propaganda, not the lies, the truth. His newspaper covered local politics. It covered business news. It covered church events and social gatherings. It covered lynchings. And in August 1898, Alexander Manly made a decision that would change everything. He wrote an editorial that white North Carolina would never forgive. Here is what you need to understand about 1898. Across the South, white Democrats were running a coordinated campaign called the White Supremacy Campaign. Not hidden, not coded, explicit, out loud, proud. Their slogan was "Restore White Rule." Their propaganda was everywhere: newspapers, speeches, rallies. And the core of their message was this: black men are dangerous. Black men are criminals. Black men rape white women. Therefore, black men cannot be allowed to have political power. This was the justification. This was the excuse. This was the lie they told to make terrorism seem reasonable. Lynchings were happening constantly. A black man would be accused of looking at a white woman wrong. A mob would form. They would hang him from a tree, burn his body, take photographs standing next to the corpse smiling, and white newspapers would report it as justice. They would say he got what he deserved. They would say this is what happens when black men step out of line. And in August 1898, Alexander Manly had had enough. He wrote an editorial responding to a white woman who had given a speech calling for more lynchings to protect white women from black rapists. Manly wrote the truth that white America could not tolerate hearing. He wrote that many relationships between black men and white women were consensual. He wrote that poor white men often did not protect their women, especially on farms. He wrote that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a black woman, which happened constantly under slavery and continued happening after. And then he wrote the sentence that sealed his fate. Tell your men that if they want to protect white women, they should start by being faithful themselves, instead of sneaking to black women's homes at night. This was the truth. Everyone knew it. White men had been raping black women for centuries. During slavery, it was constant. After slavery, it continued. Entire families of light-skinned black people existed because of white men's violence. Everyone knew, but nobody was allowed to say it, especially not in print, especially not a black man pointing out white hypocrisy, especially not when that black man owned a newspaper with statewide distribution. White newspapers across North Carolina reprinted Manly's editorial, not to agree with it, to weaponize it. They reprinted it with headlines screaming about Negro insolence. They reprinted it with commentary calling for Manly to be lynched. They reprinted it as proof that this is what happens when you give black people power. They lose their minds. They insult white womanhood. They must be put down. Furnifold Simmons, the chairman of the North Carolina Democratic Party, saw his opportunity. He had been planning for months to take back power in the state. The fusion government was too successful, too popular. They could not win a fair election, so they were not going to have a fair election. They were going to have terrorism, and Alexander Manly's editorial gave them the excuse they needed. Simmons organized what he called the White Government Union. Membership was secret, but historians estimate at least 500 men joined. Their leaders were not poor whites. They were the wealthy elite. Alfred Moore Waddell, former Confederate officer and congressman. Hugh McRae, wealthy businessman who owned railroads and real estate. J. Allen Taylor, attorney. These were not random vigilantes. These were the most powerful men in the city organizing a coup. Their stated goal was to remove Negro office holders. Their real goal was to destroy black political and economic power completely and permanently. And they were not hiding. They held public rallies. They gave speeches in front of thousands. Waddell stood on a platform and said out loud, "Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him, shoot him down in his tracks." This was not a secret conspiracy. This was an open promise of genocide, and nobody stopped them. Not the governor, not the police, not the federal government. Nobody. The night before the massacre, November 9th, 1898, 500 white men gathered at the county courthouse. Most were Confederate veterans. Some were businessmen in suits. Some were poor whites who had been promised that once black people were removed from power, their own economic situation would improve, which was a lie, but they believed it. They were armed with Winchester rifles and Colt pistols. Some had brought a Gatling gun, an early machine gun capable of firing 200 rounds per minute. This was not a mob. This was a paramilitary force with military organization and commanders. Alfred Waddell gave the orders. They would march at dawn to the offices of the Daily Record. They would burn the building. Then they would force every black city official to resign at gunpoint. Anyone who resisted would be killed. Anyone who ran would be hunted. And anyone who stayed would live under white rule or not live at all. Meanwhile, across town in the black community, church bells rang. Emergency meetings were held at St. Luke AME Zion Church. Reverend J.W. Hood, 70 years old, stood before hundreds of terrified families. He knew what was coming. Everyone knew. The threats had been published in white newspapers for weeks. Hood told them the truth. "We are outnumbered. We are outgunned. If we fight, they will massacre us and use it as an excuse to massacre black people across the entire state. Our only chance is to avoid confrontation and pray that cooler heads prevail." He was wrong about the cooler heads, but he was right about the massacre. Families went home that night and packed what they could carry. Some buried valuables in their yards. Some loaded guns knowing they would probably die, but refusing to die without a fight. Mothers hid their children under beds and in closets. Fathers stood watch at windows, and everyone prayed. Everyone prayed that when the sun came up, somehow this would not be as bad as they feared. They were wrong. 5 o'clock in the morning, November 10th, 1898. The sun had not risen yet, but the city was awake. You could feel it. The air was cold. The streets were silent in that way that means something terrible is about to happen. At the county armory, 500 armed white men assembled in formation. Not a mob, a military unit. They had commanders. They had a plan. They had 3 Gatling guns mounted on wagons, and they had the blessing of every powerful person in the city. The mayor did nothing. The police did nothing. The governor was conveniently out of town. This was going to happen, and everyone knew it. At 7:30 in the morning, they marched. Boots on cobblestone. 500 men moving through downtown Wilmington in broad daylight, carrying enough weapons to fight a war. Heading toward the corner of 7th and Love Streets. Heading toward the Daily Record. Alexander Manley was not there. He had fled the night before, warned by friends that they were coming to kill him. He took nothing with him, just ran. Left everything he had built, the printing press, the office. 3 years of work building the only black newspaper in the state. Gone, but the building was still there. And the white mob wanted to send a message. They surrounded the building, broke down the door, smashed the printing press with hammers, threw the type the metal letters used to print the newspaper into the street, poured kerosene over everything, furniture, papers, files. 3 years of archives documenting black life in North Carolina, and then they lit the match. The Daily Record burned in 15 minutes, flames shooting through the roof, black smoke rising into the November sky visible for miles. A crowd of white people gathered to watch. They cheered. They celebrated. They took photographs standing in front of the burning building, smiling like they were at a picnic. And black people watched from a distance, knowing that if they said anything, if they protested, if they cried, they would be next. But burning the newspaper was just the beginning. Alfred Waddell stood in front of the crowd outside the burning Daily Record building and read what he called the White Declaration of Independence. Not independence from Britain, independence from democracy, independence from black political power, independence from the idea that all men are created equal. He declared that Wilmington would no longer be ruled by Negroes and carpetbaggers. He demanded that every black city official resign immediately. He gave them until noon. Anyone still in office after noon would be killed. Then he sent the mob to make sure the message was received. Armed groups of white men fanned out across the city, heading toward black neighborhoods. Brooklyn, the black middle-class neighborhood, was targeted first. They went door to door searching for what they called armed Negroes. Anyone who looked at them wrong, anyone who talked back, anyone who had ever held a city job, they dragged out into the street. Some they beat, some they shot. Some they told to run and then shot them in the back. Near the railroad tracks at Hempstead Hill, a group of black men made a stand. About 20 men, some of them veterans who had fought in the Spanish-American War, just months earlier, armed with hunting rifles and pistols. They were not attacking anyone. They were defending their neighborhood. The white mob had Gatling guns. It was not a fight. It was a slaughter. Estimates vary, but at least 14 black men were killed at Hempstead Hill. Their bodies were left in the street as a warning. White newspapers later called this a battle. It was not a battle. It was an execution. None of the white attackers died. None were even injured. They had machine guns firing 200 rounds per minute at men with single-shot hunting rifles. This was not combat. This was murder. On 4th Street, the main business district for black-owned shops, the terror intensified. White mobs stormed through breaking windows, looting stores, setting fires. Josh Halsey, a black laborer, who had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with the newspaper, just a man trying to get to work, was shot in the back while running away. He bled to death in the street, while white people stepped over his body. George Davis, a black carpenter, was dragged from his home in front of his wife and children. They beat him with rifle butts until his skull cracked. They left his body in his front yard. His children watched. How many people died that day? The official count, the number white authorities admitted, was 9. 9 black people and 0 white people. But that is a lie. Survivors who lived through the massacre. Black families who hid and then fled the city consistently reported seeing dozens of bodies. Some thrown into the Cape Fear River. Some buried in unmarked mass graves. Some loaded onto wagons and taken out of town. Dr. Silas P. Wright, a white physician who treated wounded black people in secret because helping them was dangerous, later said he believed at least 100 people were killed. Black community leaders who escaped and told their stories in northern newspapers estimated between 60 and 300 deaths. In 1998, 100 years later, construction workers found a mass grave in Wilmington. Human remains, gunshot wounds to the skulls, buried in a location that matched exactly where survivors said bodies had been dumped. Forensic analysis dated the remains to the late 1800s. The city refused to do a full excavation. They covered it back up. Even 100 years later, they did not want the truth uncovered. Think about what this means. Imagine hiding in your house listening to gunfire. Imagine the smell of smoke as your neighborhood burns. Imagine watching your neighbors shot down in the street and knowing the police are helping the killers. Imagine your children asking why this is happening and not having an answer, except that some people hate you for existing. Imagine knowing that everything you built, your business, your home, your savings, everything is about to be taken, and there is nothing you can do. You cannot fight back because they have machine guns. You cannot call the police because the police are with them. You cannot appeal to the law because they are the law now. All you can do is hide and pray you survive, and then run. That was November 10th, 1898 for black people in Wilmington. That was the reality, and when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried and the blood was washed off the streets, white America called it a riot. They said black people started it. They said white citizens had to restore order. They said it was unfortunate, but necessary. And they made sure nobody would ever know the truth. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the massacre was winding down, but the coup was just beginning. White men with guns marched to City Hall. They surrounded the building, went inside, found the Board of Aldermen, the city council meeting in emergency session, trying to figure out what to do. 4 of the 10 aldermen were black. All 4 were told to resign immediately or be killed. They resigned. The white Republican aldermen were given the same choice. They resigned. Mayor Silas P. Wright, a white Republican who had governed fairly and supported the Fusion Coalition, was told his resignation had already been written. All he had to do was sign. He signed. Police Chief John R. Melton, same thing. Resign or die. He resigned. Every single city employee who was black or who had been appointed by the Fusion government fired immediately. 45 minutes. That is how long it took to overthrow the government. Then they held an election, right there in City Hall. Not a real election, a voice vote among the armed mob. Alfred Moore Waddell, the man who had organized the coup, who had given the orders to burn and kill, was declared mayor. A new board of aldermen, all white Democrats, was installed. A new police force, all white. Many of them the same men who had been killing black people in the streets that morning, was sworn in. And just like that, democracy in Wilmington was over, replaced by a government installed at gunpoint that nobody had voted for. This is what a coup looks like. Armed men force elected officials to resign, install their own leaders, claim they represent the will of the people, even though no election happened, and call it restoration of legitimate government. If this sounds familiar, if this reminds you of something you saw on television on January 6, 2021, you are paying attention. The methods change, the goal stays the same. When you cannot win democratically, you use force. But the coup was not complete until they removed every black person who had any power or influence. The Committee of 25, the white leaders who had organized everything, created a banishment list. 32 names, prominent black men who had to leave Wilmington by morning or be killed. Not arrested, not charged with a crime, just told to leave or die. John C. Dancy was on the list, the United States Customs Collector, a federal official appointed by the president. It did not matter. They came to his house that evening, gave him 12 hours. He packed what he could carry, left his home, left his position, and fled to Washington, D.C. He would never return. Armand W. Scott, the publisher who owned the largest black printing company in the state, was on the list. They came to his 3-story house downtown, told him he had until morning. His house was worth $8,000 in 1898, money equivalent to about $280,000 today. He owned it free and clear. He abandoned it, fled with his family to Washington, D.C. White men moved into his house the next week, claimed it was abandoned property. The city sold it at auction for a fraction of its value. Dr. Thomas R. Mask, the physician with the practice at 820 Nixon Street, treating both black and white patients, was told to leave. He had spent years building his practice, earning the respect of the community, saving lives. None of it mattered. He fled to Baltimore. His office was looted, his medical equipment stolen, his patient records destroyed. Robert H. Bunting, the merchant who owned 11 properties in downtown Wilmington, was forced out. He had built wealth from nothing, invested carefully, acquired real estate, became one of the most successful black businessmen in North Carolina. They took it all. The properties were declared abandoned, sold at auction to white buyers for pennies on the dollar. Bunting fled to New York. He would die in poverty 20 years later, never recovering what was stolen. Reverend J.W. Hood, the 70-year-old bishop of the AME Zion Church, was too old and too well known to exile easily. He had planted over 100 churches across North Carolina. He had been assistant superintendent of public instruction right after the Civil War. He had been a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention in 1868. He was a legend, but they still came to his house, still threatened him, told him if he spoke publicly about what happened, he would be next. Hood stayed in Wilmington, but his church, St. Luke AME Zion, was burned. The congregation that had been the spiritual center of Black Wilmington for decades had to meet in secret in homes. They did not rebuild the church for years, and Reverend Hood, a man who had never been silent in his life, who had preached freedom and justice for 40 years, was forced to watch his city destroyed and say nothing publicly. He wrote letters in private. He told the truth to whoever would listen behind closed doors. But in public, he had to be silent or be killed. That is what terrorism does. It does not just kill bodies, it kills voices, it kills truth, it kills the ability to resist. By midnight on November 10th, the exodus had begun. Trains leaving Wilmington were packed with black refugees, entire families with nothing but the clothes they wore and whatever they could carry in their hands. They left behind homes they owned, businesses they had built, churches they had founded, friends and family they would never see again. Estimates vary, but historians believe between 2,100 and 2,500 Black residents fled Wilmington in the 72 hours after the coup. That was almost half the black population, an entire community destroyed in 3 days. Where did they go? Some went to other cities in North Carolina, Raleigh, Charlotte, Greensboro, hoping distance would keep them safe. Some went north to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, joining the Great Migration before it even had that name. Some went south to South Carolina or Georgia, hoping to disappear into larger black communities. And some just scattered, going wherever they had family or friends or any connection that might offer safety. They became refugees in their own country, exiled from the city they had built and the wealth they left behind. Gone. Property was seized under abandoned property laws. If you fled and did not come back within 30 days, the city declared your property abandoned, put it up for auction, sold it to white buyers who got houses and businesses and land for a fraction of their value. Bank accounts were frozen. If you were on the banishment list, if you were suspected of being involved in politics, banks would not let you access your money. Some people lost their entire life savings. Insurance policies were worthless. When black-owned buildings were burned or damaged during the massacre, insurance companies refused to pay claims. They said it was an act of war, not covered. Or they said the property owners had provoked the violence, voiding the policy. Either way, no money. Businesses could not be sold. Who would buy them? The entire black commercial district was destroyed. Stores were looted. Windows were smashed. No black businessman could safely operate in Wilmington after the coup. So the businesses just closed. The inventory was stolen. The equipment was taken. Years of work building enterprises that employed people and served the community gone overnight. How much wealth was stolen? Conservative estimates say black residents of Wilmington lost at least $1.5 million in 1898 money. Adjusted for inflation, that is about $50 million today. But that calculation does not include compound growth. That $1.5 million, if it had stayed in black hands and grown at normal rates over 127 years, would be worth somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion today. That is your stolen inheritance. Not symbolic, not metaphorical. Real money, real wealth, real property that should have been passed down through your family, but was taken by force and never returned. And here is the most important part. If those families had kept their wealth, if they had been allowed to stay and build and invest and pass their property to their children and grandchildren, how different would your life be today? If your great-great-grandfather had been one of the 11 properties Robert Bunting owned, and it had stayed in your family, you would be wealthy. If your great-great-grandmother had inherited Dr. Mask's medical practice, your family might have had doctors for 4 generations. If your ancestors had kept the businesses they owned on 4th Street, you might own commercial real estate in downtown Wilmington worth millions today. The wealth gap you see. Now the fact that median white household wealth is $188,000, while median black household wealth is $24,000, did not happen because black people do not work hard. It happened because every time black people built wealth, they stole it. Wilmington 1898 is proof. And Wilmington was not unique. Let me show you the pattern. Let me show you that Wilmington was not an isolated incident. It was a blueprint, a template, a method that was used over and over across the South, wherever black people gained political or economic power. Same tactics, same excuses, same federal silence, same theft. And when I show you this pattern, when you see how many times this happened, you will understand that this was not random violence. This was policy. This was systematic. This was the intentional destruction of black political and economic power across an entire region. Let me take you to Colfax, Louisiana, April 13, 1873, 25 years before Wilmington. Grant Parish had a majority black population and a disputed election for governor. Republicans said their candidate won. Democrats said theirs did. Both sides claimed to be the legitimate government. In the parish courthouse, a black militia occupied the building to defend the Republican government. They were armed, but they were not attacking anyone. They were protecting the courthouse from a Democratic takeover. On April 13th, 150 white men, many of them Confederate veterans, attacked the courthouse. They had a cannon. The black militiamen fought back for hours, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Eventually, they ran out of ammunition. They surrendered, waved white flags, came out with their hands up, and the white mob executed them, lined them up and shot them, one by one. Somewhere between 100 and 150 black men were murdered that day. 3 white men died in the actual fighting. The rest was just execution of prisoners who had surrendered. Federal troops arrived days later. Too late. The courthouse was burned. The bodies were everywhere. And what happened to the white men who did this? 9 of them were charged under the Enforcement Act, a federal law designed to protect civil rights. 3 were convicted. They appealed to the Supreme Court. And in 1876, the Supreme Court overturned their convictions in a case called United States versus Cruikshank. The court ruled that the federal government could not protect black citizens from violence committed by private individuals, only from violence committed by state governments. This ruling gave legal cover for every massacre that came after. It told white terrorists that if they acted as private citizens instead of government officials, they could murder black people with impunity. For over 100 years, history books called what happened at Colfax a riot. The official name was the Colfax Riot. A historical marker was erected in 1951 that read, "On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 whites and 150 Negroes were slain." This inscription is erroneous. The word riot implies both sides were equally violent. The phrase 3 whites and 150 Negroes were slain makes it sound like equivalent losses. It was not a riot, it was a massacre. It was the execution of black men who had surrendered, and the death toll was minimized. But that marker stood for decades teaching Louisiana children a lie. Now let me take you to Hamburg, South Carolina, July 8, 1876. Hamburg was a majority black town across the river from Augusta, Georgia. It had a black militia unit that was legal under state law. These were not criminals. These were citizens exercising their legal right to form a militia for self-defense. On July 4, 1876, the militia held a parade. 2 white men claimed the parade blocked the road and they could not pass. It was a manufactured incident. The road was wide enough. They could have gone around, but they wanted a confrontation. They filed a complaint. Days later, over 100 white men calling themselves Red Shirts, a white supremacist paramilitary group, showed up in Hamburg demanding the black militia disarm. The militia refused. They were legal. They had done nothing wrong. The Red Shirts attacked. The fighting lasted hours. Eventually, the black militiamen ran out of ammunition. Some escaped. Some were captured. 6 black men were taken prisoner, lined up, and executed one by one while their families watched. The white mob then went through the town looting black-owned businesses and homes. The entire black leadership fled, and white Democrats used the Hamburg massacre as propaganda for the upcoming election. They said, "See what happens when you give Negroes power. They become violent. They must be controlled." It worked. Democrats won the South Carolina election in 1876, ending Reconstruction in the state. The massacre was not a tragedy to them. It was a successful campaign strategy. Jump to Danville, Virginia, November 3, 1883. Danville had a majority black population and an integrated city council, black police officers, black magistrates, real political power. Days before the election, white Democrats staged what they called a riot. 4 black men were killed. The entire black leadership was forced to resign at gunpoint. And in the election that followed, Democrats won through intimidation and terror. All black officials were removed. Segregation laws were immediately passed. The same pattern. Now Phoenix, South Carolina, November 1898, the same month as Wilmington. This was coordinated. White mobs attacked black voters at polling places across South Carolina as part of what they called the Red Shirt Campaign. In Phoenix, a small town in Greenwood County, at least 12 black men were killed on Election Day. One of them was Fayette Watson, a minister and teacher. He was dragged from his home and shot in front of his family for encouraging black people to vote. No one was ever prosecuted. This happened in multiple towns across South Carolina simultaneously. Wilmington got the attention because it was bigger, because they overthrew an entire city government. But the same thing was happening in small towns everywhere. Then, Ocoee, Florida, November 2nd, 1920, Election Day. July Perry was a black landowner who owned a farm and encouraged his community to vote. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been revived in 1915 and was now stronger than ever, threatened violence if black people tried to vote. Perry and others went to the polls anyway. They were turned away. That night, a white mob of over 500 men attacked the black community in Ocoee. They burned down every black home and church. They killed somewhere between 50 and 60 black residents. The entire black population of Ocoee, over 500 people, was driven out. They never came back. Ocoee remained an all-white town until the 1980s. Every single piece of property owned by black families was seized. No compensation, no justice, just theft. Do you see it now? Do you see the pattern? Colfax, 1873. Hamburg, 1876. Danville, 1883. Wilmington, 1898. Phoenix, 1898. Ocoee, 1920. Different states, different years, but the same method every single time. First, manufacture a crisis. Claim black people are dangerous or incompetent or insulting white people. It does not matter if it is true. Just create a narrative that justifies violence. Second, attack with overwhelming force. Do not give them a chance to defend themselves. Use superior weapons. Use military organization. Make it a slaughter, not a battle. Third, massacre anyone who resists. Execute prisoners. Kill leaders. Make examples of people so everyone else knows what happens if they fight back. Fourth, force all black leaders into exile. If they are alive, banish them. Make them leave or kill them. Remove everyone with education, wealth, or influence. Fifth, seize political control. Install your own government. Do not wait for an election. Just take over and claim you represent the will of the people. Sixth, legalize the theft. Pass laws that make it impossible for black people to vote, or hold office, or recover their property. Make the coup permanent through legislation. This was not chaos. This was not random violence. This was systematic. This was policy. This was the deliberate, coordinated destruction of black democracy across the entire South. And it worked. By 1900, black voter registration in the South had collapsed. In Louisiana in 1896, there were 130,000 registered black voters. By 1904, there were 1,300, a 99% drop. In Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, the story was the same. Black political power that had been growing since 1865 was destroyed in one generation. And it stayed destroyed for 70 years, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But destroying political power was not enough. they also had to destroy the evidence. Let me show you how they covered it up, how they made sure you would never know what was stolen. There were 4 methods: physical destruction, legal suppression, educational erasure, and media manipulation. Let me start with physical destruction, because it is the most obvious and the most brutal. At Wilmington, they burned the Daily Record. That eliminated the archives. 3 years of newspapers documenting Black political organizing, business success, community life, all gone. They burned Black churches, St. Luke, AME Zion, and others. Churches were not just places of worship. They were community centers, where records were kept, where meetings were held, where history was preserved. Burning churches meant burning history. They altered city records. After the coup, the new white government went through official documents and removed the names of Black officials. Property deeds were forged or destroyed. If you fled Wilmington and could not prove you owned your house, too bad. The city sold it to someone else, and they hid the bodies. Mass graves, bodies thrown in the Cape Fear River, burial in unmarked locations. If there are no bodies, you can claim fewer people died. You can say it was not that bad. In 1998, 100 years later, construction workers found human remains while digging a foundation. Forensic analysis confirmed gunshot wounds to the skulls. Artifacts dated to the 1890s. The location matched exactly where survivors had said bodies had been dumped. This was evidence of the massacre, but the city of Wilmington refused to do a full excavation. They covered it back up and kept building. Even 100 years later, they did not want the truth fully exposed. Across North Carolina in 1900, after Democrats took control of the state legislature, they passed laws requiring the destruction of Reconstruction-era records. Any documents showing Black people in positions of power, expunge them, destroy them. Make sure future generations cannot find proof. This was official policy, mandated erasure. Then there was legal suppression, making the theft permanent through law. In 1900, North Carolina passed a constitutional amendment requiring literacy tests to vote. But here was the trick. If your grandfather had voted before 1867, you were exempt from the test. This was called the Grandfather Clause. Sounds innocent, but it was designed to eliminate Black voters while protecting white voters. Black men could not vote before 1867 because of slavery. So requiring a literacy test for anyone whose grandfather had not voted meant requiring it for almost all Black people. Meanwhile, poor white people whose grandfathers had voted were exempt. The result was immediate. Black voter registration in North Carolina dropped by 90%. The Supreme Court eventually struck down grandfather clauses in 1915, but by then, the damage was done. An entire generation of Black political power had been eliminated. They also passed Jim Crow laws immediately after taking power. In 1899, North Carolina mandated separate railroad cars for Black and white passengers. In 1901, school segregation was codified into law. In 1903, interracial marriage was banned. In 1905, a poll tax was implemented. You had to pay to vote. If you were poor, which most Black people were, after having their wealth stolen, you could not vote. And property seizure was legalized. They created abandoned property laws. If you fled during the coup and did not return within 30 days, your property was declared abandoned. The city auctioned it off. White buyers got homes and businesses and land for a fraction of their value. This was legal theft, sanctioned by the government, and there was no legal recourse. All the Black lawyers were gone. All the Black judges were removed. Courts were staffed entirely by white Democrats. If you tried to sue to get your property back, you lost. If you tried to file a complaint about the massacre, it was dismissed. 0 prosecutions for murder, 0 prosecutions for arson, 0 prosecutions for theft. The federal government did nothing. President McKinley made no statement. The army was not deployed. Governor Russell requested federal troops to restore order. His request was denied. Republicans in Congress who had fought for civil rights during Reconstruction had lost interest. After the Compromise of 1877, when Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for winning the presidency, black people were left defenseless. The federal government abandoned them, and white supremacists knew they could act with impunity. Then there was educational erasure, making sure children would never learn the truth. North Carolina public school textbooks from 1900 to 1970 did not mention the Wilmington Massacre. 70 years of children going through school and never hearing about the only coup in American history. When it was mentioned at all, it was called the Wilmington Race Riot, blaming black people. A 1913 textbook used in North Carolina schools said Negroes became unruly and had to be put down by force to restore civilization. That is what they taught children. Your ancestors were unruly. White people had to restore civilization. The lie became the official history. They also taught the lost cause narrative. This was propaganda, claiming that the Confederacy was noble, that slavery was not that bad, that Reconstruction was a disaster, because black people were incompetent. This narrative was taught in schools across the South for generations. It was in textbooks. It was in lessons. Teachers who challenged it were fired, and the heroes of the Wilmington coup were celebrated. Alfred Waddell, the man who organized the massacre, was portrayed as a hero who saved the city. Streets were named after him. Schools were named after him. The Red Shirts, the paramilitary group that terrorized black voters across the South, were romanticized as defenders of Southern honor. This poisoned the minds of white children, teaching them that white supremacy was good and right. And it poisoned the minds of black children, teaching them that their ancestors were failures. Universities were complicit, too. The University of North Carolina historians wrote official histories defending the coup. A 1940 textbook from UNC described the events of 1898 as white citizens restoring civilization to Wilmington. Black scholars who tried to challenge this version were denied tenure, were pushed out, were silenced. The academy, which should have been a place for truth, became a place for propaganda. It was not until 1998, 100 years after the massacre, that North Carolina finally created an official commission to study what happened. The 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission. Even the name still called it a riot. But at least they were finally investigating. The commission spent 8 years researching. They interviewed descendants of survivors. They reviewed historical documents. They brought in historians and sociologists. And in 2006, they released their report. It confirmed everything. It was a coup. It was a massacre. The death toll was far higher than officially reported. Black wealth was systematically stolen, and it had been covered up for a century. But even with an official report, most Americans still do not know this happened. It is still not taught in most schools. It is still not in most textbooks. The erasure continues. Finally, there was media manipulation, controlling the narrative in newspapers and later in history books. The white newspapers in North Carolina in 1898 blamed black people for the violence. The Raleigh News and Observer, the most influential paper in the state, ran headlines like Negroes responsible for riot and white citizens forced to restore order. They claimed Alexander Manly had insulted white womanhood and provoked the response. They claimed black people were armed and dangerous, and white citizens acted in self-defense. None of this was true, but it was printed, and people believed it. National newspapers followed the same script. The New York Times headline on November 11, 1898 read, "Negroes incite riot in Wilmington." Not coup in Wilmington, not massacre in Wilmington. Riot, blaming the victims. The article claimed that black people had started the violence, and white citizens had no choice but to respond. This version spread across the country. It became the accepted narrative. Even in the North, even among people who were not particularly racist, the story was believed. They manufactured a false narrative, and it stuck. Photographic evidence that contradicted the narrative was suppressed. There were photographs taken during and after the massacre. Pictures of the white mob posing with weapons outside the burned Daily Record building. Pictures of armed red shirts marching through the streets. These photos existed, but they were not published. Not in newspapers, not in magazines, not in history books. One surviving photograph finally surfaced in the 1990s. It shows a large crowd of white men, some holding rifles, standing in front of the ruins of the Daily Record. They are smiling, posing for the camera like they are proud of what they did. That photo was not made public for 90 years. Meanwhile, black newspapers told the truth. The Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Freeman in Indianapolis, they interviewed survivors who had fled north. They published first-hand accounts of the massacre. They called it what it was, terrorism and theft. But those papers had no distribution in the white-controlled South. Black people in northern cities might have known the truth. But black people in North Carolina, the people most affected, were silenced. And the white majority never heard the black version of events. The truth was suppressed. The lie was amplified, and the lie became history. Now let me connect this to today. Let me show you why this matters right now in 2025. Why this is not ancient history. Why this affects your life. Why understanding 1898. Wilmington explains the world you live in. Start with the wealth gap. You have heard the statistics. Median white household wealth is $188,200. Median black household wealth is $24,100. That is almost an 8-to-1 ratio. 8 times more wealth in white families than black families. Why? The usual explanation is that black people do not work as hard, or do not save or make bad financial decisions. That explanation is a lie. Here is the real reason. They stole it, directly, violently, systematically. In Wilmington alone, conservative estimates say $1.5 million in black wealth was stolen in 1898. Adjusted for inflation, that is 50 million today. But that does not account for compound growth. If that wealth had stayed in black families and grown at average rates, earning interest being invested, appreciating in value, it would be worth $500 million to $1 billion today. One city, one massacre, $1 billion in stolen wealth. Now multiply that across the South. Colfax, Hamburg, Danville, Phoenix, Ocoee, Rosewood, Tulsa, East St. Louis, Springfield, Atlanta. Dozens of massacres, hundreds of millions of dollars stolen, trillions when you calculate compound growth over a century. Economists have estimated that the total wealth stolen from black Americans through slavery, Jim Crow redlining, mass incarceration, and other forms of systematic theft is over $100 trillion. 100 trillion. That is not reparations as charity. That is repayment of debt. If Tulsa had not been burned in 1921, those families would be millionaires today. If Wilmington had not been destroyed in 1898, those families would be millionaires today. If your great-great-grandfather had been allowed to keep the 11 properties Robert Bunting owned, you would be wealthy today. The wealth gap is not natural. It is not the result of cultural differences or work ethic. It is the result of theft. Ongoing theft. Systematic theft across generations.